Good afternoon. Welcome to our panel this afternoon. I am so excited to get a chance to introduce these lovely colleagues. And today we're going to hear from Ryan New, who is the K-12 instructional lead for social studies. And he's going to speak to us about his district's process for incorporating Black historical consciousness principles into the inquiry process to help students create arguments and take informed action. Joining him will be teachers Kathleen Feit from Bates Elementary School, Angela Clay from W.E.B. Du Bois Middle School, and Brandon Riddle from Seneca High School. I'm Dr. Jessica Clanderud, and I am the director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education at Berea College, and I'm also an assistant professor of African and African American Studies. We're going to be using the Q&A function to ask questions and offer comments. So please use that function to log your questions and we will answer as many of them as we have time to as our panel finishes up their presentation. Thank you so much. And I believe I'm tossing this over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Thanks for having us. Again, my name is Ryan. I'm the instructional lead for JCPS schools and a understudy of Dr. Crowley and Swan that you guys heard before. So everything that we're about to talk about stems directly from their work. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen real quick, just a brief presentation about sort of where we are in our district, and then I'm gonna turn it over to our teachers who you guys really wanna hear from. All right, so part of what we're looking at today is how do you take this inquiry method that Kathy and Ryan spoke about earlier, and combine it then, right, as they were doing in the previous session. And now how can we do that for a K-12 understanding? So the first thing you'll need to know is that, as mentioned before, we've adopted a new set of standards, and those standards come with a new set of curriculum. What we've tried to do is basically take the structure of the IDM, this beautiful document, as a foundation for understanding how we might re-engage K-12 education in a way that becomes much more meaningful and much more transformative to the students. As we all did as kids, we came home, maybe still do as parents, and say, what did you learn today? What inquiry says is it's going to shift that narrative. It becomes, what question did you investigate today, right? And so part of that then is this idea of inquiry is part of the process that we've built our larger curriculum around. So just very briefly, if you'll notice here over on the upper left-hand side, we have our dispositions, the type of thinking not only that we want students to do, right, but also learn how to do. You'll notice here that we've got civic mindedness, right, the driving force of our classrooms, and also Black historical consciousness, which I'll talk more about in just a second. Inquiry then becomes the process, right? The IDM became that questions, tasks, and sources element. And as Kathy said earlier, you can't have inquiry without students discussing and deliberating what's going on. That process then, guided by the dispositions, enables students to do two major elements. It enables them to create arguments using different types of literacies, one of which is critical literacy, and ultimately be able to take action in order for the students then to reimagine what their world's going to look like. This is why we're calling this approach our democratic classroom. Part of the disposition that's driving much of the new work was developed by Dr. LeGarrette King from the University of Missouri. What you're seeing here is the most up-to-date version of his Principles of Black Historical Consciousness. We've used these principles currently as the beginning elements of a elective that is currently at the middle school and high school levels. We're hoping to be able to use these principles as well in retransforming not just electives, as we know is problematic, but also the core classroom as well. And that'll be something actually that I'll be working on with some of the teachers that are here with us today as we move forward. You'll notice that these principles reimagine what it is that students are going to be focusing on. That instead of talking about perhaps what did you learn today, or even what questions you investigate, we hope that students will be able to respond by saying, well, I learned about, we were studying questions around power and oppression, or about Black agency, resistance, and perseverance, or Africa and African diaspora, Black joy, Black identities, or Black historical contention. And then the follow-up becomes, well, how did you go about studying it? And then you're going to be able to dive deeper into the particulars that were studied that day. There's an article about this. I can get this out to you guys as well as part as a follow-up, right? So you guys can read about this. But this became one of the major elements of how we're reimagining social studies education in Jefferson County, but using the inquiry process and the IDM to operationalize it, right, as that process. So this is, and again, this is all open, jcpssocialstudies.com. Anybody can go to it. We're trying to make everything that we do here free. This is the overview of that elective I've mentioned earlier. Again, you're seeing the thinking, the process, and the products as we're helping teachers plan in a yearly long understanding where they might be able to go with these dispositions as they're trying to create new types of learning for their students. Kathy mentioned earlier about how questions are the driving engines of inquiry. These are some of the questions that both students and teachers and community members help us come up with, showing that our process involves all the stakeholders who are going to be inheriting sort of some of these questions. And you'll notice here that we're not pulling any punches with a lot of where we're looking at. Being able to name something like white supremacy is going to be key in uprooting it from institutional understandings. We can't dance around some of these questions. And so we're just going to go ahead as our teachers and students want it and go ahead and put those straight into the question so that we're forced to sort of deal with it. Take a look, for example, at Unit 3. How did racist policies divide the country? Of course, we're looking at elements that are happening then, but you can see how a compelling question like this is going to make space for conversations that are happening today. What we have here with you are 3 teachers, right? I'm going to let them sort of introduce themselves, right? And then I'm going to pull back, right? Just to give you guys a context of where we are. Please note that our teachers are at different places, right? The very first place that we move developing Black historical consciousness is actually into the middle and high school grades. So when Kathleen starts to talk about it, she's moving into the inquiry world and is absolutely killing it as a first grade teacher. And you'll be able to see this during, by the way, NTI. Everything that you're about to see is all done during our virtual learning, right? So the naysayers who say you can't do this, well, I've got 3 examples to say that's incorrect. So basically for them, they're going to go through very quickly just how they're approaching some of the inquiry aspects in a lesson. So we got a few slides, and after that, we'll sort of turn it over to Jessica for you to pull us into questions and get some feedback from the folks. Okay, so Kathleen, just tell me when you want me to advance your slides.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan, especially for that great introduction. I appreciate that very much. So I use the compelling questions, and all of the questions that I use right now are coming from the JCPS framework, which Ryan said is on the JCPS website. They are very helpful, especially when it comes for first graders. So we've talked a lot this year about choices and about making good ones and what makes a good choice. And we're starting to get into that community piece now. So for me, when it comes to thinking of the Black historical conscious, it comes into the sources that I pull, because the way I typically do it is I will show a picture and then I start asking questions to get the students to start thinking and get them to answer the questions. When we're in the classroom, I typically don't give a lot of information until I have heard from the students and maybe there's an aspect that I want them to get that they're not quite picking up, and then I'll start guiding them towards that. During NTI, I do a lot of videoed lessons. And so in the video, I have to give them more information, I guess, than I would in the classroom, but I still try to limit that, trying not to give them what I think, but try to draw out what they think. So when I'm looking for sources, I'm making sure a lot of times it's just a picture. It may be a short video. And I will try to make sure that, like I said, everybody is accepted or brought in there. That's the word I'm trying to use, sorry. So what you're seeing right now is one of our tasks. So every lesson that I do ends with some kind of task. It's usually pretty quick, especially for first graders. It'll be looking, making a picture, writing a sentence. I'm trying to push them at this time of year to write more than just one sentence. It might be a slide where they find multiple pictures to show what they're thinking. They might do a quick video where they tell me what they're thinking. So we are finishing up our unit, or we just finished our unit on communities and the choices we make as a community. And this unit, or this supporting question, was what choices bring communities together? So one of the standards that's covered in that is investigating how people can benefit themselves and others by choices. And so we looked at the different jobs that we have that support other people and bring communities together. Some of those I used were firefighters, teachers, doctors. I also used jobs that were trades, like electricians, which, you know, we need to have the electricity and bring us together with all the things we need. And then at the end, I wanted to also say things that bring us together in our community are things that we do that are fun, like Thunder Over Louisville. So that was also brought in there. So you'll see, really, I was blown away by these pieces you're seeing right now, because I didn't talk a lot about helping others. And 2 of my kids went there without me bringing that to them, which is what I love about inquiry, because I have an idea of where I'm leading them, but I love when they go somewhere that I wasn't actually leading them, because that means they're understanding the question and they're getting it. So you'll see one person, they had made kits for the homeless, or food for the homeless. And they said that's one way that we bring the community together. It absolutely is one way that we come together as a community to help those who need it. And then the middle one that you're seeing there used some of the sources we used. So you can see that they picked up what we were talking about and then used it. So they got that evidence and they used that source that I wanted them to use. And the last one was another great example that really hadn't come to my mind, but is a great answer. And that is, if someone's sick, we come together to help them as a community. And that community can be, and that's one thing we had to talk about, was our community could be big, as in the community of Louisville. It could be small, as in those people we just see on a regular daily basis. So as far as inquiry, I just see my kids so much more engaged. They're into it. I can see they're learning. I know it's something that's going to stick with them, and it's not going to be gone after we're done with the test.
Hi, my name is Angela Clay. I am the 8th grade social studies teacher at the W.E.B. Du Bois Academy. And so I'm just going to get right into it to make sure. But I did want to give Ms. Fight her definite due diligence and how well she's doing inquiry. She's not only just a colleague of mine, but she's also my son's 1st grade teacher. And I can tell you that inquiry is done very well with fidelity in her classroom. So thank you, Ms. Fight. And so the presentation that I'll be going over, how I introduce the Black historical consciousness principles in my classroom, is we talk about what makes Africa, Africa, and making this the distinction of where things began, life began, connecting everything back to the African diaspora. Many times our students are introduced to Black history, sometimes with slavery, and these things of this narrative of always being oppressed and Egypt being separate from Africa. And so this lesson really created this connection back to this home source. My biggest question was, how does the Kentucky Derby represent more than large hats? And the way we looked at this is through 5 different sources. And we started with this equestrian figure that I had found from the Smithsonian Museum. And the picture, when they first looked at it, it was just me asking questions as far as, how do you think this made the Black jockey? Where did this come from? How is this connected to the Kentucky Derby? We then moved into a picture of Isaac Jefferson. He was a blacksmith who worked under Thomas Jefferson. And then from there, we went to the Constitution and looked at the 13th Amendment and what that did. And then finally, we looked at Edward Dudley Brown, who is local and native here to Kentucky. And he was a slave that eventually became a jockey. And then finally, we looked at Jim Crow and saw how that disturbed this narrative with the Kentucky Derby. And so in the end, the students were asked then to put all these sources together and to explain how Africa is connected to the Black jockey. And what they found out was that the Black jockey was not birthed out of the Kentucky Derby. The Black jockey was not birthed out of the freeing of, the end of the Constitution. The Black jockey was not birthed out of slavery. However, the Black jockey was birthed out of exactly where he came from, which is his home in Africa. That was not the first time he was introduced to a horse or seeing a horse or riding a horse. They were very skilled before they came. And so it was able to allow our students to see that Black excellence and that connection to their home. And then also exploring other sports and how we can connect that back to our African diaspora. Ryan, did you have the timeline slide? Yes. And so this is our final piece in which we did was the timeline. So these are the actual artifacts that we used. The Mali equestrian figure. This is Isaac Jefferson. This is the actual 13th Amendment. And then Mr. Dudley himself. And then finally, Jim Crow. And then the question is, how do we get back to this? How do we not let this disturb this narrative again? So thank you.
All right, I'm up. Well, first of all, let me just clarify. I couldn't find a picture of just myself. So that's my lovely wife, Elizabeth, there. She was able to find that picture for me. All the pictures I had, they didn't seem like it would be something to put on here. So, all right, Ryan, you can move us forward. Please. Change the slide. Thank you. So I'm just gonna, briefly talk about this one lesson that is part of our Developing Black Historical Consciousness elective that I'm teaching to 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. This course, Ryan and some of his colleagues in conjunction with Dr. LaGarrett King sort of created this course to change the way that African-American history is viewed, the Black histories are taught. And, I taught African-American history for several years. And now that I understand, or at least I'm starting to just, develop an understanding of some of these Black historical consciousness principles, it really just makes me wish so badly that I could go back in time, and sort of undo some of the teaching that I did, which the problem with it now that I understand, in retrospect, is that it was frequently taught about Black people as opposed to through Black voices, which is something that Dr. King, tries to emphasize. And it's very important to understand that there is not a history, there's not this singular history that we're teaching, that it's, Dr. King emphasizes there are histories. And I didn't do a great job of that for several years, and you can't undo what you can't undo. But going forward, this class, this elective, and then these principles being built into the U.S. history that I teach, it really, I think, broadens the students' opportunity to understand and develop a real understanding of actual, histories as opposed to that singular narrative. So whenever you hear people complain or argue against the type of education we're doing, it's always, well, this, like, they're portraying history as some sort of singular timeline, and that's something we need to disrupt and create contention in the education that we're doing. So, just this lesson here, just briefly, how did African American abolitionists provide a voice for enslaved people? And at the end, the FPT there, that's what Kathleen had referred to. At the end, there's going to be a product every single day that you do this type of learning. So you can use that product to really quickly assess like what the students understand and don't understand, which is really one of the most powerful pieces of the IDM, in my opinion. You really get a sense every single day of exactly where the kids are, and you can sort of identify misunderstandings. So we got two sources here, David Walker, The Appeal, and then Frederick Douglass, What is the 4th of July? What to the Slave is the 4th of July? So Ryan, if I'm like running out of time, just let me know. Go ahead and go forward, please.
Brandon, you can continue, or did I miss a slide that you need to have?
Yeah, can you move us forward to I believe there should be another slide.
I don't think there is.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, man.
I thought that's my thing. No, that's all right. So the assignment, what we did was I provided the students with some text of these two different pieces of literature, and they were broken down. So I would like to, there's a lot to this. For those of you who are really hopefully going to move forward with this IDM model and this inquiry model, there's a lot to it. And before I even talk about it, let me just say it's very challenging. And it really requires us as the stewards of the discussion to ask the right questions. And that to me is the hardest part, is asking the right questions. Ryan, I've seen him do it, and it's like, man, that looks perfect. And I'm not quite good at it yet, but I'm really, I'm working on it. So what the students have, they've got the source, and it's never, you as the teacher have a lot of leeway in terms of how much you want to present to them. The appeal is a long, very long document. I had excerpted some pieces, and what I had the students do is use something that Ryan had taught me, which is called a main idea log. So it was like after a certain section, just have the students, what's the main idea of that? So they pause, they're taking time to kind of think about what they just read. This is a lot better than just questions from the text where they're just going to be like scrolling through trying to find a specific answer. But that encourages the kids to really develop their own understanding of it, which you can see. And then after they all read source A, their group has to come to a consensus about who his audience was and what the point of this was. That discussion portion, when you get the different ideas coming together and sharing their thoughts, it goes back to like what Kathleen said, they'll go all these different directions you don't anticipate, which is a great thing, because then they get to share one another's ideas and they're hearing things that maybe they wouldn't anticipate. And so it's very important as a teacher to not like be locked in and think this is exactly the way it's going to go. You have to, be nimble and agile. But this lesson was focused on the idea of agency and resistance. And I deliberately only used throughout this whole unit, all the sources were derived from Black voices, which is really important. And Ryan has recently sort of told me he wants to include photos of everybody who's presenting or every source. And I think that's really valuable so the students can get it sort of takes their idea of historical education, which has always been centered on the white experience and the white narrative, and treated Black voices as sort of ancillary. We need to sort of tear that down and make sure that Black voices are just part of the discussion. And that goes through US history and also this elective, obviously. But I'll just tell you that these lessons have the potential to really generate conversations and discussions and thought that students are not frequently exposed to. And in my experience, the biggest problem I've had is that the students come to the class with this certain understanding of what a history class looks like. They don't think of it in terms of social studies, and they are just kind of programmed to see, okay, we've got when is the multiple choice test? And there are no multiple choice tests. It goes back to what Dr. Swan was saying in the previous session, where we're asking for critical sort of analysis and how crisp are you in your explanation of this? It is a total shift in terms of their understanding. And it's really challenging in my experience for the high school students because they've sort of been programmed that way. I'm looking forward to the day after, students have been in Kathleen's class and Angela's class and then come to me, and this is sort of normalized. But I don't is there anything else I need to include, Ryan? I don't want to.
No, I think that, the goal of this is just to sort of give as a foundation. This is just where our teachers are. These are just like run of the mill where they are inside their units, right? So this isn't like just for you guys, although they're here for you. This is an ongoing process where there's a question that's guiding every single day. There's a discussion that's there every single day. There's sources that are there every day. There's a task that's there every day. So I think at this point, basically we're going to open it up, Jessica, to whatever questions there might be, however you would like to take us through here. And then if there's a specific element you want to ask, that's fine. We'll also provide this sort of last show here before I pull us back so we can actually see each other, and then I'll be able to pull this up in case we need to refer to it. But here's our contact information if you'd like to reach out in any way, whether through email or through Twitter. And with that, I will stop sharing the screen and pull us into the larger conversation.
Thank you so much, team. I think it was a very informative session, and I'm excited to see what questions everyone comes up with. While we are waiting for a few folks to put some questions in the Q&A, I will spend a bit more time telling you what I'm up to, because I think it feeds into what y'all are doing very well. Right now, as a former social studies teacher, I am working with the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education, of course, and right now we're putting together a series of short animated videos looking at the origin of the concept of race in the United States. And so trying to really break down some of these barriers, but really being conscious of doing it at a level that is appropriate for a wide range of our constituents and not just kind of focused at the collegiate level. I too am a mom. I have a 3rd grader and a 6th grader right now, and they fortunately or unfortunately get to be the guinea pigs frequently for my resources that I create, because I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have high quality resources available for their use as well. So that is something you can take a look at either at the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education on Facebook, or we also have Twitter, and we also have a Facebook or email and website, which are listed in the chat. So let's see what we have here. So it looks like we have a question here. How are the units developed? Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that one. This is Angela Clay. And so the way I did my unit, it goes back to the session with Dr. Swan before about staging your compelling question. And so the first thing I did was I asked my students what makes the Kentucky Derby. And from there, they were able to give me visuals of what they thought of when they think of the Kentucky Derby during this time. And from there, it allowed me to see their knowledge of what they knew and gaps that I needed to fill in for them. One student particularly stood out. When he did his picture, in the middle, he ended with racism. And he wanted to know, how did the jockey become the jockey? And that is what actually birthed this inquiry, just asking my students and then allowing them to sit back and have free answer. And that is how mine was developed from them.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Emily here. It says, what can museums do to assist teachers in developing their curriculums, especially around Black history at a state and local level?
Yeah, I can take that one. We've been in contact specifically with the Filson, with the Fraser Museum here, both in Louisville, and also the Kentucky Historical Society, as a way of trying to curate some materials that really tell a good story. Too oftentimes our previous standards and our previous courses, especially when relied upon these tertiary, sort of national textbooks, never really were able to dig into local history. And it's those museums that allow us to do that, right? So that our students can not only visit them, but I know that they are quickly digitizing these elements. And we've got updates on if Patrick Lewis is here or Megan Cheney's here or Claire Guatney's here from each of those institutions. We've been meeting a little bit. I've been MOA for the last little bit here, but we'll be reconnecting with those folks so that it's very important for students to be able to see something in the class and be able to say, that came from Louisville, right? That came from down the street. So there's immediate intimate connection with that. And then as we are able to pull those into it, the masters of the folks that are here are able to do it. As you guys saw earlier in Angela Clay's, being able to use resources from museums as a conduit, right, to be able to look at artifacts in particular. I don't know if another teacher wants to answer some of those pieces, but that's sort of where we're thinking. And we've got a new museum that's getting its roots here, literally Roots 101. And so we'll be looking to help be able to add those into our curriculum as well.
Can I speak on the elementary level? We need some of those resources that are smaller and more easy to understand. And so I guess if museums had those specifically handy and could be able to put them in a place where elementary teachers could find them easily, then we could use them more. Because a lot of times it's what can you find when you're looking for a source. And then if it's a big long document like Brandon's talking about using on a first grade level, my kids can't use that. So if they have those sources that are easy for first graders or for elementary to understand, that would be huge for us.
Yeah, one of the things that I've used in the past, especially for talking to younger folks, is I love oral histories. I love hearing people tell their own stories. And there's a lot of different museums that are digitizing oral history interviews. And especially I find it when someone is talking about their childhood experiences, it translates a lot easier to younger kids who are experiencing the same thing. So sometimes in my research, I'll ask people about, you're a Black kid from, growing up in the 60s. What did you have for a snack when you came home from school? What was your after school routine like? And so it helps the younger students connect to, oh, wait, I do that too. I, come home and have a glass of milk and a cookie. And that's, my usual thing too. So it helps people kind of connect to similar experiences. And those resources are available. They're just not always as well promoted as sometimes we would like to see. So it's nice when we can connect folks with the resources that are useful for them.
Yeah, and I think that, Kathy Swan is always great about pointing these aspects out. She taught a class about how to teach with objects with the Smithsonian. And these help really drive curiosity, right? You see a thing and you're like, what is this thing? Like, what's going on with it, right? And that really can help bring to the forefront the importance of questions as a framing tool and as a discussion element whenever you're beginning your class.
All right, looks here like we have a question that says, how do you teach to different age groups about racism by different groups? And they've said red, yellow, brown, black, white, unique, and diverse. So how do you kind of modulate your teaching on race based on age?
So for me, I use a lot of books, picture books, pictures, little small video clips to try and reach everybody. And so that's what I use. Like the Ruby Bridges story, like you were talking about, they can connect to that because of it's a little girl. And so I like that one. I don't always use, when you're talking about first grade, I don't always use the whole story. Because it could be too long, or sometimes the content, not all of the content is appropriate for them, or they're not ready for it at this time. So sometimes I have to pick and choose, but you can find children's books out there that for almost everything that are amazing.
For me, one of the things that I encourage teachers to do, and I try to do myself, is like you have to build an honest, open community in your classroom. You can't talk about race. So, anytime we have, like, I'm talking to teachers and they're uncomfortable discussing race, I'm always curious to know, like, what kind of classroom they have, because it is a very sensitive subject for some people, and some people have very strong opinions about it, and some people have parents who don't want them to talk about these things. And this is something we have to navigate as professionals, because, and this kind of goes back to something that Dr. King has talked about, and I've heard Ryan say, like, we can't be afraid to make white people uncomfortable. And that's just a reality that we as educators have to acknowledge. I think if you could make a strong argument, the lack of racial progress in our country is because of this inability or lack of willingness to sort of change the narrative and confront these harsh, ugly realities. So what I would suggest is, like, you have to build honesty in your classroom. Your students have to know that, you are coming from a place of goodwill and that you're going to be transparent, because as soon as you lack that, as soon as you dance around the subject or you're not honest about it, they know, and they don't trust you anymore. They don't want to have these conversations with you anymore. And, in our Black Student Union at Seneca, we've had this conversation amongst these students many times where issues that are uncomfortable, the teacher's uncomfortable, and that means that they're not willing to tackle that. Well, if they're not willing to tackle it, those students really can't feel safe intellectually. They are not going to feel safe because they know that that teacher is not willing to address this, you know, the ugly reality. So to me, you need to, you know, the way that we can do this best is to build honest, transparent conversations, to be vulnerable, to be, you know, to communicate to your students that you don't have all the answers. And then you need to just try to be very deliberate in educating yourself about it. You know, there's a lot of good reading out there, and Mr. New here gave me a big stack of books to sort of help move me along. And then also, you know, for those of you who are interested in this, that I would highly recommend Dr. Kendi, A History of Racist Ideas. Where is it? I got it sitting here somewhere. What's the name of that, Ryan?
Stamped?
Stamped from the Beginning, yes. And then How to Be an Anti-Racist. Those are two books that I, you know, told Ryan that I think we should force everybody in our district who's gonna, you know, I think that's something we should all be required reading for me, because it sort of helps, especially for white teachers, it helps negotiate this, this tendency to view the world from this position of privilege, and you can kind of reorient yourself. And if you don't do that, then you're not going to be able to talk about this with your students. You're not going to make progress, and your kids are not going to feel safe.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I was interviewing some students at BSU at a high school last week, and the students said basically the same thing. They very much see when a white teacher is reticent to engage this, and that they feel that they just scream through a lesson because it's about them, right? So we see then whiteness just pop up and just populate that room. And to Brandon's point, okay, so I can't bring up any issue that I'm having, right? Things I talk about at home, things that are going on in my neighborhood, can't talk about that. This student then said, and I love it, I absolutely love it. I can't give her enough credit for saying this. She said, if you're uncomfortable, take it to the altar. Don't bring it into the classroom. And so if you've got an 18-year-old teacher or 18-year-old student who is mature enough to be the teacher of her own white teachers when they're engaging in that, I think it's very telling of where our students want to go. They're chomping at the bit to learn about these things. And white teachers cannot be the dam that's holding them back, right? And that's why inquiry is so incredibly important, is that it raises all this identity, all this consciousness to the surface by looking at different perspectives while also honoring the very perspectives of the students who are trying to figure this out.
I'd also just like to say, oh, I'm sorry, Angela.
No.
Just real briefly, like our students, we have to acknowledge our whiteness as white teachers, okay? And like, that's something we just have to do. But also, you can do this honestly without, like, I know a lot of teachers like, well, I don't want to like alienate my white students, you know, or I don't want to make them feel guilty. I don't want to make them feel, you know, embarrassed or shamed or whatever. But if you're like, first of all, you're going to allow your students of color to feel that way, right? And protect your white students, which doesn't quite seem right. But also, like, you can teach honestly and not do that. Like, it's possible. It's possible to, you know, if you have an honest dialogue in your classroom in an open community, you can do that, and your students you don't have to worry about your white students feeling guilty or shamed, because they're part of the conversation. So the goal is not to like silence white voices. That's not what we want. You know, we really want like genuine equity in our discussions, right? And so the best way to do that is to create that open classroom. Sorry, Angela.
No, I also think it's twofold too. I think also as educators, it has to be some onus on the university to prepare teachers to be able to speak race into the classroom. You cannot just give me a 7-week course and say, this is my racial equity. It needs to be built within the collegiate curriculum to prepare the teacher to have that conversation in the classroom. And it's not always sometimes just the white teacher being uncomfortable. It's the other way around. You know, when you look at Dr. LaGarrett King's principles, and he talks about what is Blackness, right? My Black may not be your Black, but I'm still Black. And so if I haven't experienced the same thing, there are going to be some things that I may not, as a Black teacher, be able to relate to some of my Black students. Does that take away from my Blackness? No, it doesn't. However, if I'm not prepared to have this conversation, then I'm not going to have it in my classroom. So for me, it starts at the top. It starts with that education level at that university when you commit to becoming an educator. And then actually once you get into your school, to be able to have that admin support, that when parents push back, that I know my admin is going to support me and say, you go forward with your lesson. And that's very important as we move forward this day and age.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, Angela. I really appreciate that. I'm currently in the process of planning it. I will make sure this whole community gets the information, but anti-racist pedagogy, especially in teaching Black history, this summer coming up. So stay tuned for a workshop in the summer that might be available for you all to think about attending, because teaching in an anti-racist way is something that most of us did not get training in college for at all. And I think it's really critical to help promote these principles of Black consciousness that we're talking about, because Black joy is important. It can't, when you're teaching about race in the classroom, it cannot just be all of the oppression all of the time and none of the agency and none of the strength and none of the resilience, because boy, is that hard on our students of color that are sitting in the classroom, because it actually reinforces white supremacy. And that's what I think people don't always get, is that when you're constantly hearing how downtrodden your people were and the people that looked like you, that is actually reinforcing white supremacy in the classroom. So it's really important to balance that, in my opinion. So I think that that's something that I really appreciate in terms of these principles that we're discussing. There are so many good questions, and I'm gonna have to try to condense here. I think Angela already touched on this a little bit, but I'd be interested in hearing some other points here. What is your advice for how teachers should respond in a primarily white school when parents question or push back why they are studying anti-racism?
So, do you mind if I take this one real quick?
Yes, go for it.
Ryan, you know where I'm going. So I actually experienced this in a district myself. As a Black teacher, I was told that my classroom was too Black in there. And how I dealt with it, teaching predominantly white students Black history, it made me go harder. Honestly, it did, because what that showed me was that this is the group that needs it more than anything. And so you have to get uncomfortable with the uncomfortable. And through that, you know, I don't mind sharing. It's nothing that I'm embarrassed about. I did get suspended for a day for doing what I did, but it was worth it. And so it reminds me of the words of John Lewis: sometimes you gotta have some good trouble. And that's what we caused. We caused some good trouble in that school district. And the year that I was there was the first year that they ever celebrated Black History Month in that school. So I saw that change, and it was enough for me. So get uncomfortable with the uncomfortable.
Ryan, speak to that, please. I know your experience in Boyle would be very valuable here.
Yeah, I came from I came from one of the whitest districts in the state, which is Boyle County. And oftentimes I would come in and I would say, how many folks in here talk about race at home with their parents or their family? And all the hands go up. And I say, well, how many of you guys talk about what it means to be white? And all the hands go down. And I say, so what can we deduce automatically about race? Who's being attributed to? As I was trying to type in the chat there for Karen, because I noticed that Brandon, you kicked that off to me, is that I think that this is very important to understand the kind of ethical and moral stances that we're trying to take. If you're saying that we can't talk about something inside of a class, then I'm not really for sure what schools are for. And I think it really goes back to this idea of discomfort on the teacher's end. I was too in a discomfort area. We all have been, especially if you're white and have grown up in the area that I grew up in, which is down in Somerset. And so what part of that journey to that teacher who asked that, Karen, is making sure that you are reading as much as you possibly can and engaging those conversations with your white colleagues in particular. There's no reason to burden our Black colleagues with a conversation that they've been engaged in from the very beginning, that they could start to understand what was happening around. So part of that is making sure that you're taking these strong ethical stances inquiry is a fantastic way of going about doing it. That way, it's not your opinion. You're just looking at sources. It's not your opinion. You're looking at questions, and you're having the students that have to deal with those sources and have to deal with those questions. And during a discussion, you just keep asking more questions. What makes you say that? Where have you heard things like that, right? And you're digging into where those students are in a way that, may be uncomfortable at the very beginning of it, but there's only one way, right, of getting more comfortable with it, and it's actually diving in. There's a lot of books out there, right, that sort of talk about you're not going to get it right many times. Who knows how many times I've not gotten it right in the last 3 minutes that I've been talking. But it's for me to be able to reflect on and figure out. The other piece of this is making sure that you have very strong administrative support. When Angela told me about what was going on, Angela, do you mind if I share this part? As soon as we found out what had created some issue for Angela, we immediately put that into our curriculum at the district level. That way we can support from the very beginning, right? If there's an issue with it, you can come and talk to me. You don't need to bother a teacher that's trying to do good by your kids, right? You can come and talk to the district, and we're better able to support that. But if you don't mind to email me, we can talk more one-on-one about some of the strategies that might be good, some of the ways in which you might approach, because I don't want to usurp the time here, because it's a fantastic question. It's also a very loaded question, and I would probably need to know more of the background before I can make any assumptions.
Okay, I want to jump into this one because I'm going to kind of combine two questions into one here. This one from Catherine says, social studies is an elective at my elementary school. Students only have these once or twice a week. How can I best incorporate these topics in my reading, writing, math, or SEL lessons so they experience this method of inquiry more often? So that's kind of part one of the question. And the other question asks, how do we adapt this model for special ed, neurodivergent learners that need a little additional adaptation to help this work for them?
So I'll touch on the elementary for sure, because that's that is me. So, and I also know how social studies, it kind of gets pushed out of the elementary, because like we heard earlier from Dr. Swan, reading and math and all of that takes precedence, and then it gets squished to the end. So we have very limited time. That's the great thing about this inquiry. It also goes to the second question too. It is so adaptable for whatever you need. I can fit one of these lessons in about 15 minutes. It's not as in depth as Angela and Brandon can go. And sometimes my task is simply report back to me what you got from this question, right? Like a turn and talk, and then share with me a little bit. I also bring a lot of it into ELA. Like I talked about using the Ruby Bridges book, that will be used in my reading. I'm getting ready to use a fabulous, well, I think it's fabulous, Martin Luther King Jr. book, and it'll be used in reading to support what I'm doing there, but also get that social studies into it. So that's one way I get it in, but the great thing about inquiry is it's completely adaptable.
One thing too, I definitely love to add to that, because Ms. Fite is great, not just because she's a colleague, but she is my son's teacher. But one of the things I definitely would like to add into that is also giving credit to Black authors. In academia, sometimes we don't use enough of them. And so in your sourcing, source Black authors, source, Black pictures and things of that nature. If you're doing artwork, find a Black artist. And that still brings that into the classroom. Or even if you're covering Native American, use something that's authentic from that time, from those people. Instead of always, we kind of we'll Google the first picture that comes up and like, this is good. Research who you're using in that classroom. And then another way, to the second point of the question, when you're talking about like tier 3 children and how do we gear it towards them. In my classroom, everything is scaffolded, right? And so at the end of the day, if we're talking about culture, if you only know that culture is, for my birthday, we do birthday cake this is my family's culture, and we blow candles out and this is what we do, that's fine. Because at the end of the day, you understand what culture is. And then for my tier 1 kids who are deep, they're going to get that deep level of culture. But at the end of the day, I want my students to understand when you recognize culture in other places. And so that's a beautiful way to always scaffold it out.
Gentlemen, would either of you like to weigh in on this?
You know, I think that I'm just going to echo what Brandon said, just elevate that voice. I think it's criminal if elementaries don't teach social studies. I think it's criminal if, maybe not criminal, maybe immoral. That's probably a better thing there. That they don't teach science. If the last, if the last year hasn't proven the capacity for science and social studies, I don't know what type of convincing is needed. Not to mention there's plenty of research out there that talks about how you can learn to read through the social studies. This is how by the way, most people learned how to read back in the day, is through the social studies stuff, right? And I remember one of the very first times that I came to Jefferson County, I was meeting some academic instructional coaches, and they said, oh, what, I'm a social studies guy. And they're like, oh, I wish that we had more time for social studies, but we spend so much time reading and writing. And I just responded by saying, what do you think social studies is? And she was like, great point. So we read, we write. That's what we do. We create arguments. We take action in the world. We ask hard questions, right? That's what we're all about. So with that said, I will also say that, especially for the Kentucky folks, elementary folks here, this is something I pointed out to my district multiple times. The way the standards were written, 5th grade typically bears the brunt of social studies. Just so you guys know, 5th grade starts 1600. Which means that many of our students of color are going to begin with enslavement. And I think that's a real problem. 4th grade is 1400 to 1700, not much better. But if we were to look at 1st through 3rd grade, which looks at their community, which looks at the state, which looks at the global understanding, they will be able to see positive representations, right, of agency and everything else, running countries and what have you, right, from the very beginning. So then we can actually have some present day context in order to dive into the historical context of elements. With that said, do not be afraid to pull in modern day understandings that represent counter narratives, right, to what's being discussed in a class, even if you're still 5th grade or 4th grade.
There was a question that was on the Q&A and it disappeared, but I'm going to weigh in on it a little bit, talking a bit about how we can pull this over into the science classroom. So how can inquiry learning go into the science classroom? But I want to throw in there that just because we're talking about especially this African history and pre-colonial Africa, oh my word, there's so much richness there that students don't normally get to hear. And again, by beginning with the idea of enslavement, we lose so much, again, resiliency that African people have in the diaspora that we don't always hear about so much in schools. So I'll give you a little example. My 6th grader this year was running around talking about Egypt, of course, because that's where they're at in their world history curriculum right now. And he made some comment along the lines of, the colleges that were happening in Europe. And I laughed and I said, oh, you mean the first college which was actually in Africa? And he's like, no, it wasn't. I'm like, oh, yes, it was, my child. Let me show you. And this is the peril of having a history professor for a mom, probably. I reached to the bookshelf, pulled off a book about Timbuktu and went, here, check out all this great stuff. And he went, no way. So he was like lost reading that for a little while, learning about the richness of science and technology and medicine in the African world. And I think very often to think about who we hold up as the model, who are the classics that everyone should read. It doesn't have to be a bunch of old white guys. First of all, there are great African and African-American authors. There are Latina authors and indigenous authors and tons of people that we should be reading and holding up as classics, especially in North America. I'll try to get off my soapbox right now. But as you prepare your lessons and prepare your work, think about all of these ways that we can work across disciplines, because the evidence is so rich that the more connections students get to the material in a variety of disciplines, the more they hold on to that learning. So it's really important that we're talking to each other across disciplines as we prepare our work.
And if I may, can I just add on with you with that one? Because I just love what you just said. And realizing that Blackness is global. right? It's not just here in North America. You get Afro-Latinas that we don't, talk about. You get Haitians. Blackness is global. And I think that's something that we definitely need to celebrate and see throughout, the world, that how, beautiful it is. And my Black in America may not be the same Black as your Black wherever you are, but we're still connected. And I think showing that Blackness is global. When we're talking about, the American Revolution, as Dr. LaGarrett King points to, talk about the Haitian Revolution. Look how that inspired so much. And so when you think of Blackness, don't just center it all the way here in America. Take it global, and you'll find out it's a beautiful thing across the world.
Well, and I'm in Central and Eastern Kentucky. We talk about Black Appalachian. And people don't always remember that there's Black and Indigenous Appalachians that are a part of our heritage way back here. So it's important to have those connections. We maybe have time for one more question if one pops into the chat here. But I want to make sure I plug those of you that are remaining on the call. One of my students, Amani Adair, wrote and performs our beautiful closing piece called Empty Chairs at the end of the panel. It's a short theater piece. So I hope you're able to hang in there at the end of a long day for a last visual treat. Oh, yay. Angela Clay is an amazing educator. Yay. All right, any other questions from anybody? Any last words from our panelists to share?
Thank you all for having us. I know that I speak for Kathleen and Angela when I say we appreciate, having this opportunity to talk to you all about it. And just, I would like to emphasize that I can't encourage you enough to dive full, body head first into this. This is the only way that you should be teaching social studies. It is really powerful. It has the potential to create, the type of education, type of students we want. And it's going to be hard. I'll just tell you that. It's hard to find sources. It's hard to think of the right questions. But this is the only way to teach. If you teach another way, you're missing the boat. Okay. I just want to advocate for it as much as possible.
I'm going to piggyback off Brandon, and I'm going to say I'm completely with him. This is the best way I've taught social studies in my entire teaching career. But be flexible and be patient with yourself. You feel free to take it in baby steps. That's what I did last year. Just a couple units, just a few lessons to get your feet wet. And then once you do, you'll find it's much easier than you think it's going to be. And then also, like he said earlier, give your students time to come to it too, because they're not used to it. And so it takes them a minute to get used to it. And then also, like he said, you also have to have that open communication where it's safe to talk, because if it's not safe, they don't want to be a part of it. But thank you for having us. Yes, definitely.
Definitely. Thank you all for having us. And to even piggyback off with Brandon and Ms. Fight, the last thing I can say is lean to your students. They have some of the best questions. And if your question isn't good, it's okay to throw it out and start over. Ryan taught me that. And in the middle of a lesson, I've learned, hey, your question was better than mine, and I'm going to give you credit. And this is the avenue we're going to take. And it's okay. And it gives them that power, and it becomes more of a student-led classroom. And I get to sit back and watch my students really unpack and unfold. So be comfortable with making mistakes. It's never perfect. I don't care how long you've been doing it. Be comfortable with that.
I can add nothing to any of what has been said other than I get to work with these fantastic folks. So thank you guys very much.
Well, look at that. We are right on time. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. Thank you, panelists, for your great insights. And I hope that you all got a lot out of it. And if I'm looking at the chat quickly, it looks like that was the case. So thank you, everyone.